Does the COVID-19 safety protocols requiring prospective jurors to wear cloth face masks that cover their nose and their mouth deprive the defendant of his right to meaningfully participate in jury selection? To find out, you have to read People versus Ramirez, but it's 9 pages. Don't have time for that? I've got you covered. This is TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, where I cover New York Court of Appeals cases and I try to do it in 5 minutes or less. This is the episode on the case of People versus Ramirez. The citation for this case is 2024, New York Slip Opinion 00795, published by the New York Court of Appeals on February 20th, 2024. The issue in this case is whether the defendant's rights to be present for all material stages of the proceeding are violated by the implementation of the COVID pandemic safety protocols during jury selection. I'll explain all that in a few moments. The background that's helpful to understand this case, it's first helpful to know that the defendant, pursuant to Article 1, Section 6 of the New York State Constitution and the cases of People versus Antimarchi and People versus Sloan, the defendant has a right to be present for all material stages of a criminal trial and to meaningfully contribute to his own defense, which includes the opportunity to be present for a jury selection and to observe the body language, facial expressions, and demeanor of prospective jurors. And there are cases like People versus Antimarchi, People versus Sloan. These are New York Court of Appeals cases that have said the defendant's presence on matters related to jury selection includes the right, the opportunity to see the jurors' facial expressions, demeanor, and other subliminal responses, as well as the manner and tone of the verbal replies of the prospective jurors, so as to kind of ferret out any perceived bias or hostility. Because a defendant doesn't want a juror, neither does a prosecutor, who is at all biased to the case. So what happened here? The facts are the defendant was, on November 17th, 2017, the defendant was driving a vehicle while inebriated by alcohol, with an alcohol level well above the legal limit. He was driving with several open alcoholic beverages and some closed ones. And while he was driving like that on the Long Island Expressway, which is a major highway on Long Island, he got into a multiple vehicle collision. 1 person died. 4 people were seriously injured. He was then indicted for vehicular manslaughter, vehicular homicide, manslaughter in the second degree, and other crimes. His criminal trial on these charges started in April of 2021, right smack in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And New York State Office of Court Administration had implemented emergency safety protocols that were in place for jury selection, including the prospective jurors would be assigned specific seats in the courtroom. They would be arranged in a socially distant manner from each other, trying to honor that 6 foot of space protocol. And the jurors would be required to wear a face covering while in the courtroom until they were being asked questions directly by the attorneys, at which point they would shift, they would lower their cloth face masks and wear a protective face shield that would allow the attorneys and the defendant to see their face through the plastic, the clear plastic. The defendant objected to this safety measure. He argued that Antimarchi and Sloan allowed him to observe every smile and frown of a potential juror, not just the jurors he was speaking to, not just the juror that's being asked a specific question, but the juror to their left and right and around the courtroom. Because sometimes when you're doing jury selection, you talk to one juror and the juror to the right makes a face or rolls their eyes or pouts or lets out a chortle. And then you could say, well, Mr. Jenkins, you seem to have a reaction to that. What do you think? So the defendant objected to this, and the court overruled the objections and implemented the safety protocols, and the defendant was found guilty of all 12 charges he was facing. He then appealed, saying that his due process rights and his rights to be present for all stages of the proceeding were violated. The appellate division affirmed the trial court's decision, said the safety procedures did not violate his due process rights nor his right to be present for jury selection, and it goes to the Court of Appeals. And here, it's a very interesting oral argument. You should watch the oral argument. It's fascinating. And basically the holding here is they say it's undisputed that the defendant was present for all phases of the proceeding. And he was able to hear the questions posed. He was able to see everyone's eyes, their eyebrows, see if they had their arms crossed. He could see all that. And with respect to the individual jurors being asked questions, he could see their entire face behind the plexiglass. But he could not see, it's undisputed that he could not see all the other jurors at the same time, their face, because their mouth and their nose were covered. But they say that due process requires a balancing of the defendant's rights and the rights of everybody else in the courtroom. And here the due process rights were not violated because the balancing procedures here were proper and they struck a good balance. And with respect to Sloan and Antimarchi and his rights under the statute and the Constitution, they say that right is specifically with the juror being questioned. The defendant doesn't necessarily have a right to simultaneously as at the same time, you might use that when there's no COVID pandemic. When someone's asked a question, you look around and see what everyone else's reaction is. But the right the defendant has, it does not include a right simultaneously to see everyone's mouth and everyone's nose at the same time. The right only allows the defendant to see the individual prospective juror being questioned. And because that's the extent of the right, there was no violation by the safety protocols requiring everybody else to have their face covered while they were not being questioned. And that's the case of People versus Ramirez. Have a good day. If you like what you just saw and want to see more just like it, please hit like or subscribe to let me know.